Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we're here for week number 5 of the LCK Spring Split. It's the overview and analysis video. I'm very excited to get into week number 5. We obviously are really starting to narrow down where these teams are in terms of the LCK. It very much has been a top versus bottom kind of story in the LCK, but a lot of, interesting matchups, a lot of games and series this week between teams that are relatively close in the standings, and so there is a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. But if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. If you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the LCK leading up to this point, you can of course check out the LCK playlist up in the iCard right now. But without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything in week number 5 into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be updating my power rankings after 5 weeks of action. Don't know how much they're going to change. They really haven't changed all that much at all this year, basically at any point, but obviously we will update them if necessary. But with all that being said, it's time to jump into the actual analysis of week number 5. It was a regular week here. We are just getting over the halfway point. This is essentially the middle of the split here in the LCK, and that means we're really starting to figure out where these teams are and what kind of trajectory they are on. And we kicked off day number 1 with a pretty interesting red matchup between T1 and Nongshim RedForce that T1 is going to be able to pick up a 2-1 series win in. Obviously, it would have been pretty bad if T1 would have dropped this series. They have been undefeated ever since losing to Gen.G in their first series of the year, but they have looked fantastic ever since then. And Nongshim, to their credit, I think, have consistently looked, I guess, like a tough out. I think that's the best way I can put it. They're not a particularly good team. They don't really have great macro, but they do know how to make games interesting, and they certainly did make this series interesting. We've seen teams like Nongshim be able to upset teams like T1 when they're not paying attention here in the LCK in the past. It just was not meant to be in this particular series. I think Nongshim has a lot of good going for them. Game 2 was very, very nice from them, but at the end of the day, Faker is the best way in the world. That champion is so new. That champion has so many intricacies. We've seen so many people play him at the pro level already, and none of them play him like Faker. He's going to get player of the series here for both game 1 and game number 3. Genuinely fantastic stuff coming in from Faker. Really, I mean, we talked about his re-emergence last year in 2023 as one of the best players in the world. Not that he had been bad by any means between like 2018 and 2022. He'd still been a really good player, but it very much felt like he was kind of on the decline from being one of the best in the world. He was somewhere in like the top 15 to 10 best players in the world, right? He wasn't top 5 like he had been, in his prime, number 1 in his prime, but that all changed last year when he was spectacular all year long. We really saw the difference that he made on T1 once he was out of the lineup in the summer split, and obviously his individual performances back that up. He has very much matched that pace so far in 2024. I think that's the most encouraging thing you can say about Faker so far, is that he really has been a hyper carry for this team. He is once again in the MVP race here in the LCK, and I think he just will be until the end of time. He is the greatest League of Legends player, and he continues to look amazing. New champion, super complicated, a ton of different factors. He's the best one at it in the world. It's crazy how much he can do on this champion, how he's consistently in the right place, how he's always using the right ability in the right order. It's really like fantastic that he has such a early grasp on how this champion is supposed to be played optimally. He just is able to destroy games. Game number 3 was won almost solely off of Faker, so credit to him. I think the rest of this team was still pretty good here. Zeus was great in game 1 on the Gnar. Wasn't quite as good on the Yone or on the Cassante. Zeus is going to have some up and down performances. He has been almost exclusively up over the course of this split. I think this has been the best start to a regular season he's ever had, but he's never really going to be perfect from game to game. That's never really been the MO. It's never been the scouting report on Zeus as a player. Still the best top laner in the LCK, at least at the moment, but if you are looking for concerns, Gumayushi really is not playing up to his own standard. His game 2 was awful. Like, the AD Twisted Fate, I get it, it's working in certain places, but Pro has not been one of those places. Solo queue very much feels like the place where Twisted Fate ends up popping off. We've seen it work a lot more in the top lane than it does in the bot lane, at least at the pro level, but Guma played really bad basically across this entire series. I mean, the Sennas were better, but his positioning is really starting to get concerning. He's getting a little bit lackadaisical with how he approaches fights. I think that's fine. This is something that I would expect to get better as the games get more important. He's just playing Nongshim here, getting caught out a couple of times and having an absolute stinker in game number 2. It's okay. I'm not going to freak out. I'm not going to just lose my mind over it, but I do want to see him do better in the upcoming series. I think KT has been really strong this split. I think Owner has been fine. Really not a star, but like a good player in the jungle position, but it's really been Faker and Zeus that have really been the two hyper carries for this team, the soul laners, and then KT that I think have been the stars for T1. If those three can keep it up, they're still going to be one of the best teams in the world, even if Guma is playing below his level, even if Owner really hasn't taken that next step that we kind of hoped he would. T1 is still one of the most dangerous teams in the world, even with that. But for Nongshim, they're okay. Like, again, it's weird because I feel like I constantly am hyping this team up, even though they're not winning series. I think they've gotten significantly better from what they were last year. I think, unfortunately, their mid lane position is still a bit of a problem. Call Me is going to get dud of the series here. 3 games of Taliyah really didn't do anything specifically in that game number 3. I felt it was pretty bad. I think Din was awful in game number 1, but he was really good in game number 2. You could say the same thing about Sylvie. Not really good in games 1 or 3. A little bit better in game 1, but was really good in game number 2, and so kind of left out the dud of the series conversation for me. And Call Me was kind of the third player that I think really disappointed in the games that they lost here. He's just not been very good at this level. Nongshim has not been able to find a mid laner that can perform at even a replacement level over the past year, whether it's Quad, whether it's Fiesta, whether it's Call Me. Anybody that they put into that spot has just not been good enough to be able to play at the LCK level. And I get it, right? Mid lane in the LCK is very difficult to play. We're seeing a lot of teams really struggle with that position down at the bottom of the standings. You know, DRX with Satab, Bro with Karis. None of these teams are really, you know, popping off in those roles in the mid lane, but, you know, Call Me was somebody who had a ton of hype coming around him after the Challengers League performances he was able to put out, and he's just not been able to live up to it. I think the rest of this team was actually pretty good here, though. Din and Sylvie looked really good in game number 2. Really excited that Din is starting to play a little bit more consistent on the top side of the map. He's not a perfect player. He's still going to have a lot of bad games, but he came into this year as the consensus number 10 top laner in the league, in my opinion, and he's been slightly better than that. Sylvie, I think, has also been significantly better than he was last year, for as much as that's worth. He was really bad last year, and Jiwoo and Peter have always been a really good bot lane. Jiwoo is legit at AD carry, and Peter's an LCK caliber support, if a lower one, but it's just not enough. T1's too good of a team, and Call Me really is not good enough at the moment to be starting in the mid lane in the LCK, one of the more detrimental players in the LCK. But for T1, again, really nice win. Faker looks amazing. Zeus is looking strong. You wish you got it every single game from him, but the games you get, you're going to take. KT looks great. If you can get, you know, Guma and Owner to really step up and start buying in and playing at the level they were last year, or even playing on the level that players like KT and Zeus are playing on, this is going to be one of the best teams in the world. Again, basically, no question. They are near the top of the standings for a reason. 8-1 is not a lie in their record. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1 here, and it's a battle of 6 and 2 teams near the top. Hanwha Life Esports taking on KT Rolster. And Hanwha Life Esports picks up a super important 2-0 series win. This is almost a season, like, defining 2-0 win. This is very important for them. But before we talk about Hanwha, I just want to laugh a bit. And this doesn't have anything to do with, like, the quality of team that KT is. I know some people think I'm some sort of KT Rolster hater. I know I've kind of underestimated them for most years, and, you know, generally I kind of get a little bit, I kind of get a reputation of being a little bit lower on KT than everybody else at most points in time, but trust me, I have nothing against the organization. I like the org, I like the fans, I like everything about it, but oh my god, the 2-0-0-2 thing is real. Like, it is becoming incredibly apparent that this is something that you have to be concerned about when it comes to Pioshik plus Beryl as a duo. Obviously, they avoided the 0-2 last week because they got that week off for Lunar New Year. Their 0-2 week ended up being a week off, so that's big. That ends up working out really well for them, but coming into a week after a 2-0, this might be an 0-2 week for them. Obviously, we don't know yet, but, you know, jokes aside, like, the memes are real. Like, that's what DRX did with Pioshik and Beryl basically every single time they played, and it seems to be carrying over here to KT Rolster, so certainly something to keep in mind. But this is a huge win for Hanwha. Like, even outside of memes, this is a very big win for this team. I think a lot of people are counting them out. I don't get it. Like, I get they didn't look as great against the best teams in the league at the end, you know, of last week, but I really do think that they are a team that you have to pay attention to, that is going to be considered one of the best in the world. I think they're right on the same level as teams like, top Esports over in the LPL. I think that that's kind of the reverence with which I speak of Hanwha Life. I think they're a very good team, and they proved that here. Player of the series, no doubt, goes to Zeka. This dude is dominating. I get it, Reddit hates him. I get it, Twitter wants to talk about how, oh, he has a small champion pool, yada, yada, yada. Social media, generally likes to use him as a scapegoat. But this guy has been spectacular so far in 2024. Has he been perfect? No, he's had a couple of bad games, but his good games have outweighed that, probably 5-1, and the good games are so dominant. And yeah, he's really good at Yone, but we talked about it last week. I went into a whole, rant conversation last week about how Zeka is often used as a scapegoat for Viper fans and for HLE fans that I don't necessarily think is fair. Well, here is both of them playing very well in one series. Zeka was a little bit more impactful, in my opinion, in terms of being able to take over on the Yone in the second game, but Viper was still really good, specifically on the Varus. In game number 1, these two together, both playing at a super high level, with Peanut, Delight, and Doran as, secondary pieces on this team, that's one of the best teams in the entire world, period. End of story. I think Zeka is amazing. I think he's a lot better than he gets credit for. I think he is clearly a top 5 to 7 mid laner in the world, which is tough company. Like, it's not like, 5 to 7, that's not that great. In mid lane, it is, right? Like, you're up against the best players in the world. You're like a top 10-ish player in the world if you're a top 5 to 7 mid laner. And I think Zeka deserves to be in that conversation. Viper is still really good, but what I think we're learning about Viper in the LCK is that he really excels at being a secondary carry, not in a negative way of like, oh, he can't be a primary carry, because we've seen him primarily carry games. That's what he was for EDG when they won Worlds. Like, he was a primary carry, somebody that played strong side every game. That was the better version of that EDG team that went on to win that World Championship. But I think specifically for this Hanwha Life team, specifically for the role that he fills here in the LCK, I think getting Zeka super far ahead and allowing Viper to be this very consistent 2v2 winner that can translate into, strong team fighting and strong mid-game skirmishes, I think that is the recipe for success for Hanwha Life, and that's what they found success on so far this year. That's what this series was. Everybody on the team was good. Delight and Peanut in particular were very good as facilitators. Doran could have been a little bit safer in terms of some of the engages he made, specifically in game number 1 on the Gnar, but generally when your carry duo, your two best players pop off in the way that Zeka and Viper were able to do in this series, not a lot else really needs to go right. You're already probably in a pretty good position. But for KT, again, the O2 curse is really starting to strike. We'll have to see what happens later in the week. Their schedule does not get easier from here. They have a telecom war later in this week, but Pyosik and Beryl strike again. This is classic, DRX random O2 week behavior from Pyosik and Beryl, where both of them were just kind of awful in this series. Pyosik has kind of been on an MVP level run over the first couple of weeks of the season. He's looked super good, really reinvigorated. It really does feel like he has expanded his champion pool. He's been willing to carry games, and specifically with someone like BDD in the mid lane, I think he's really helped out a lot in that respect. And Beryl, I think, has also been pretty good for this team. Not really this big carry in the bot lane that's like dominating games in the same way that someone like Keria or even Delight on the other side of this matchup has been doing, but he's been very solid for this KT team to allow players like Pyosik and Deft to really get pushed to their full potential. But this series was bad from both of them. Beryl's going to get done of the series, but you could very easily give this to Pyosik as well. Whoever you think was worse. Beryl's Ashe in game 2 was miserable. Pyosik was really bad in both games on the Vi and the Sedge, losing pressure super early and basically allowing Zeka and Viper to do whatever they want when he is the primary form of trying to shut them down. Both of them just played with their brains off, and I would sit here and say that, oh, I'm not worried that this is just an outlier performance. It's not what they've been playing like, but this is more of the Pyosik and Beryl that we knew. Not the bad plays, but the inconsistent plays. The fact that they would go from a week 4 where they were really good and a week 1 where they were really good to a week number 5 where they're not good at all. Like, that is very typical of Pyosik and Beryl, to have one good week, one bad week, one good week, one bad week. That's kind of what you expected from them going into the year, and that's why I think this is a bit more concerning. Obviously, you'd love for them to be more consistent, but this just seems to be the reality of them at this point. Everybody else was fine. BDD got run over by Zeka. He was definitely the better player, and BDD's honestly been only fine. He's been much more of a supportive figure on this team this split. Would love to see him get some more resources. Deft was still really good. Viper tried his best to just destroy him in lane, but Deft is too good to just like die. But most of it was because he was on scalers, and so he was losing lane anyways. Perfect couldn't really do anything. It was jungle and support that lost this series for KT Rolster, and that's definitely disappointing, but really nice win for Hanwha. Again, if the carry duo can pop off, Peanut, Delight, like, they're good enough to be secondary pieces. They're going to be consistent in most series. This is a very good team, and them moving to 7-2 is really big for them. Then moving on now to day number 2 here in week number 5, and we kick day 2 off with a battle of teams with the same record. Dplus KIA taking on FearX. And DK is going to pick up a very much needed win here. It feels like this team has been on the downside for quite a long time. At the start of this split, they just have not lived up to the expectations. A couple of these players have really not been particularly good at all at the start of this split. Players like Lucid and Kingen have really struggled. Kellen and Aiming have really not been as good as they were in the first week of this split. Showmaker's been really, really good across all of these games, but I was also the one defending Showmaker a lot last year. I thought his performances last year were mostly very, very good. I think that, obviously he would go through like 3-week stretches where he was like the best mid laner in the world, and then 3-week stretches where he couldn't play the game, and you had to live with that if you were a Showmaker fan. But this year it really feels like everything is clicking, and it gets to team like FearX that they're going to be a little bit better equipped, I would say, to beat in terms of talent. Yeah, Showmaker popped off. He's going to get player of the series. Yeah, he played Tank Azir in 2 games. Frozen Heart, Abyssal Mask. This shit sucks. Like, it's not that it's bad. I don't want to see this. I really, really don't want to play solo queue when stuff like this ends up getting played in the LCK, because it's going to be an absolute nightmare to try and deal with. Showmaker obviously was super effective, very difficult to deal with the entirety of this series, and really made life a living hell for a lot of the engagers like the Lee Sin or the Alistair as this series continued to go on, because Azir just makes that very difficult already, and also you can't really dive him. He can be a lot more of a playmaker in those circumstances because he does have more tank stats. It just opens him up to be a little bit more risky in terms of his positioning, which again allows him to do more. But also, it's Showmaker on Azir. It's not like baseline you're already in a decent position. No, Showmaker plays Azir at a super high level. It's one of his best champions, and now you've lost the game. Now it's 2-0 and you're going home. Like, that's just how this ended up going. Showmaker's been awesome across this split. We talk about all of the great mid laners. Showmaker's absolutely in there right now in terms of best mid laners in the world. It's just crazy how many of them are performing. Basically, everybody has lived up to the billing in the mid lane in the LCK, maybe with the exception of BDD, but he's still been really good just as more of a facilitator. So really good stuff from Showmaker. I think the rest of the team also played well around him. Aiming and Kellen were really solid. I think they were really good in week number 1 when they were playing weaker competition, but as they've played better bot lanes, they have not looked like they've been able to survive. Specifically Aiming, I think, has really struggled in those matchups. He's kind of gone back to a lot of the negatives that we saw from him before he came back to the LCK here 2 years ago, when he was on Billy Gaming and was this really passive player who just waited for the right opportunities and never really would push the tempo. That's kind of what he has been in the middle part of this split. It's nice to see that if he is given those opportunities to play towards the mid game, that he still can take advantage of them like he did on KT Rolster. Everybody knows I love Kellen. I think he's very underrated, but he hasn't been great to start this split either. I think this was a really good series for him, though, creating opportunities. Lucid was better. Kingen was awesome. We talked about Twisted Fate not working as much in the bot lane. It really has worked in the top lane. Basically, everywhere it has gone, it has been a pretty massive pick for whatever team ends up playing it. Kingen definitely played into that here. Clear was very aggressive on the other side of this matchup, constantly willing to fight. He picked Camille in game number 1. Like, there were a lot of aggressive tendencies here, but I thought Kingen did a good job of playing against that. DK was just the better team, and I'm glad that they ended up proving that here. They're back to 500 in terms of game score. Even if they're not in terms of series score, this was a very important win. And then for Fox, again, they're the gatekeepers. We knew that they were going to go on this big losing streak. I think they've lost 4 series in a row now. We knew this was coming. I mean, they've only played top-tier teams. Their schedule has essentially looked like, all the bad teams are front-loaded, and then you have the entire middle of the season where you play all the good teams, and then at the end of the split, you're going to get all the bad teams again. That's just what Fox is going to run into, and that means they're going to go on a big losing streak here in the middle, and this is expected. Willer's going to get done of the series. I think you could very realistically give this to Execute in the support position as well. Execute's been such a disappointment for me coming over. Obviously, I talked about how I was a little bit concerned with the team that he was joining, because as much as I loved the Sandbox organization and the coaching staff and the ability to get the best out of their players, I really didn't like their offseason. I didn't like retaining Clear in the top lane. I didn't like Henna being their big addition in the bot lane, and obviously that's kind of come to fruition, and Execute, I think, has really suffered for that, but he has taken a major step back in terms of the proactiveness that he had in the LEC coming back over here to the LCK, which is disappointing, but top side of the map was a disaster. Willer and Closer in particular did not look good. Willer's getting done of the series because, like I said, when you're playing Sedge and Lee Sin and you're having to play into Tank Azir, you're just going to be almost entirely useless. There's almost nothing that he was going to be able to do in this series to keep things alive. It was kind of a disaster for him. Closer just got outplayed by Showmaker, really never was relevant at any point. Clear was honestly very aggro, and I kind of can dig it. Like, I can dig the fact that he went out and tried to make plays, especially after he's been so bad at the start of this split. But, you know, it didn't end up working. He gave Kingen a lot of gold on the flip side of this, and Kingen actually did a lot more with that gold than Clear did in the back half of these games. And so even if Clear was generating quite a bit, it wasn't necessarily always a one-for-one, like, equal trade on both sides of the map. Hanwha was whatever. Like, he just kind of exists. That's what he's been on Bro. He's just been a guy that exists, doesn't really dominate lane, isn't really a great team fighter. It's just kind of an AD carry. This is just a team. I still think they're better than the bottom three. I think they're better than Nongshim. I think they're better than Bro. I think they're better than DRX. But I don't know how much better, right? Like, this is not a playoff team. Top 6 feels pretty locked in. And unfortunately, Fox is definitely outside of that now. But for DK, this was a very big win. If they would have lost this, I honestly would have been pretty concerned after the losing streak they had been on. But dominating this series does show that, yeah, it's a top 6. It's not a, you know, DK is not a team that you have to worry about missing playoffs. Now, can they do something once they get there? That's definitely still a question. You didn't really answer that in this series, but at least for now, we know that they are a team that has to be considered in the upper half of teams in the LCK. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and it was a top team versus bottom team. In the LCK, we know how that goes. Gen.G taking on DRX, and Gen.G is going to be able to pick up the win here. They move to 8-1 at the start of the split here, and, you know, this is a nice bounce back. Obviously, they didn't want to lose that series last week. They wanted to be going into this week undefeated and being the clear-cut #1 team in the LCK, but I still have a lot of faith in this team, and coming out and destroying DRX, I think, is a really good place to be. Now, DRX is bad. This is not a surprise. This team is not particularly good. We can talk about how Pliata has been amazing for this team. We can talk about how people really like Teddy and that he would be good if he was on a better team, but now he's not the kind of player to make a bad team better. But the top side of this map is so atrocious that it's going to be impossible for them to ever be relatively competent around the middle of the standings with them. But for Gen.G, like, they're not the middle of the standings. They are the top of the standings, and that is abundantly clear here. Player of the series is going to go to Chovy. We saw 2 Tank Azir games. Now we see 2 Carry Azir games, and he is going to absolutely obliterate on them. 19, 3, and 11, I think, does kind of tell you how dominant he was here. He's just so good at this champion at being able to make plays while also never really putting himself in a position where he can be taken advantage of. He's just so good. It's Chovy. I mean, what else do you want me to say? He's been amazing to start this split again. We're consistently talking about the mid laners that are dominating in the LCK right now. Chovy, Faker, Showmaker, Zeka. All of them are playing at a super high level, in my opinion, and Chovy might even be at the top of that list in terms of the performances that he has given so far in 2024, with him out-dueling Faker the time they went head-to-head. But it wasn't just him in this series. Canyon looked really good, specifically on the Vi in game number 1, a champion that, honestly, he has struggled a bit to be more proactive on in the last couple of years. The last 2 years on Damwon have not been perfect for Canyon, and so to see him come over to Gen.G, it took him a bit to kind of get the ball rolling, but he has been awesome in the last 2 weeks in particular, where he has really been able to carry now. Again, he was going into the weakest jungler in the league, and so how much do you want to take that for? But either way, he still was able to dominate. Pays looks amazing. Love watching him play Zeri. Obviously, this team dominated on Zeri as a champion last year. It was something they took full advantage of when it was super meta, and, you know, very much continues to be a big pick for them now. Pays is just so good on these late game hyper carries. It's the playstyle that I think he is the most comfortable in, and he really shows that you shouldn't give that to him for the most part. And then Lehens, also a great player, right? Like Keen, a great player on the top side, playing Twisted Fate, playing Udyr, and just being significantly better than Rascal on the other side here. Like, Gen.G was just better across the board. Chovy and Canyon were the standouts, but Pays was very much in that conversation as well on the Zeri. And then for DRX on the other side of this matchup, they're just not very good. Really not much else to say. Again, like, Teddy and Pliata were good. Again, they create so many options, especially in game number 2, where I think both of them played at a super high level. Teddy finally had one of those performances where I'm like, oh, you're trying to, like, crush the game. He has not been playing like that. He's been playing sound, solid, mechanical League of Legends, and I've complained about it for a while, and honestly, I'm actually going to say it on here. I think my least favorite term in all of League right now, not only Pro League, but, like, just solo queue, the League community, a term that I never want to see again is elo held. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it from anybody. I don't want to hear it about anybody. I'm so tired of that phrase because it doesn't mean anything and people use it to just throw out random accusations, but Teddy was very good in this game. I think this was the best game he played all year long in game number 2. I've been very critical of Teddy while the rest of the community has been fawning over him all year long because the guy goes neutral or wins lane by like a 200 gold and then is just super inactive the rest of the game. He waits for his teammates to make plays. He doesn't really do anything. I get that some of that is the position, but when you see contemporaries doing significantly more than him, you really just have to go, okay, at some point it is your fault, right? But but I think he started taking some of that to heart, and he played a lot better in this series. Hopefully that continues. Also worth noting, the Ziggs game in game 1 was awful. Like, he played really bad on Ziggs. It's not a champion he looked very comfortable on. I would stay away from that, but the Varus was very good, in my opinion, the first time this split where I've been like, oh, okay, maybe Teddy is, in a bad position. I think Pliata has very clearly been the best player on DRX. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. Rascal has been awful, and yet ELO hell, people will talk about that on Reddit, which is why that phrase means literally nothing. He's just a name at this point. He's one of the worst players in the LCK. Sponge is maybe the worst player in the LCK. He gets done of the series here, completely out-jungled by Canyon. Not the worst thing in the world to be out-jungled by Canyon, but he's been out-jungled by basically everybody at this level, and so it just is what it is. Satab was okay for a little bit of the series, and then was really bad for the other parts of the series, specifically Game 2 on the Akali, when he was just significantly worse. DRX is just not a complete team at all. They are very situational, and as much as I do like the bot lane, I think they're just like a worse version of Nongshim, where Nongshim has a weaker top side. They don't really have players that are playing super well, but they have an interesting bot lane. I think DRX has an interesting bot lane and no top side whatsoever, and so that's why I think they're landing here at 1-8. But for Gen.G, this is a good series to, kind of reassert yourself. 8-1 is a really good place to be. Everybody's playing super well. Not really much else to say. This was a top team destroying a bottom team. And now moving on to day number 3, our middle day of the week here, and we kicked it off with a winless team finally picking up their first win of the season. Do you believe? It's the Kwangdong Freecs versus OK BRION, and like I said, BRION picking up their first series win of the year. They were 1-16 in game score. It wasn't just 0-8 in terms of series score. This team had only won 1 game up until this point this year through the first basically half of their split. Absolute disaster, but before the halfway mark, they are able to pick up a series win here, this time against the Kwangdong Freecs, who have been hot, like white hot, over the past couple of weeks. I've moved them all the way up to number 5 in my power rankings. They were able to take down Dplus KIA last week. They were in a really good position moving into this week, but things just did not work out in this series. They played game 3 a little bit too slow, a little bit too lackadaisical, and they got outscaled and lost because of it. Credit to Bro for capitalizing on some of, the things they needed to capitalize on, but KDF needed to be a lot more decisive in this series, and they just weren't. And that's why they ended up falling here. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is going to go to the player coming back in the starting lineup here for Bro, Envy. And obviously, this is big for Envy. Being able to come back in and play super well in this series is exactly what you would want to see from somebody who was benched for not playing well. Very interesting that you bring him back in. I actually thought Samver was really good for this team in the AD carry position. He was the best player in their last couple of weeks coming in to replace Envy, and so I'm kind of surprised that he actually gets benched here and Envy comes back in, but Envy gets to play the Smolder, and as much as I would like to say it's Envy completely outplaying everybody and dominating lane phase and really showing off his mechanics and, showing that he deserves and proves to be here in the LCK. He really played Smolder, and the game went 43 minutes, and eventually he has Elder passive and just kills everybody, right? Like, that's what happened this series, is that Smolder ended up just looking incredibly strong. Now, obviously, you still have to be able to pilot that champion at a high level, and credit to Envy for not really throwing the game early, but game number 3 was all Smolder, just being able to win fights on his own in the back half of the game. This is the reason that this champion is prioritized so highly. We talk about hyper carries all the time. 3 of them for Envy here. The Zeri, and then obviously 2 Smolder games coming in. They clearly had a playstyle, and they wanted to supplement that with a lot of other things. Envy was obviously the focal point, but credit to Morgan, who I thought was really good in this series, specifically on the Cassante earlier on in game number 1. Morgan is a really fun player to watch, and Morgan and Dudu are always a really fun, lane to watch, because these two always play each other particularly very, very tough. Historically, Dudu has gotten the advantage in this matchup. Morgan has been, not as good into the other kind of low-tier team breakout top laner, but Morgan definitely got the advantage in this matchup. He was really good in this series. I thought Karis played the best that he has played all year long. It's not even close. He's had good series in the LCK before, but in 2024, he's been a bit of a disaster at the start of the year for Bro. He was actually able to do relatively well in these laning phases, probably because he's just picking comfort at this point. He's picking Ryze in 2024, not necessarily a champion that I think we've seen anywhere else in the world. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure Ryze has gotten a top level pick anywhere, but Karis played it well. Gideon was fine. Polu was fine, but Envy was definitely the carry in game 3, and I thought Morgan did some really interesting things in this series, but credit to the Bro Leavers, I thought they might go 0 and, 18? in the regular season. Nope, here is your win. They are going to go 1-8 in their first round robin, and that's not too bad. 3-17, still not very good, but could absolutely be worse. And then for KDF, this is a very momentum-shattering loss. Like, I don't really know what happened here, if I'm being entirely honest. I don't know how you get to this point if you are KDF. How do you end up losing to Bro? It's just very strange. This team just kind of was super inactive and ended up, getting punished for being so passive in this series. It happens every once in a while, but I'm not really sure why this team in particular ended up falling into that trap. Dead of the series is going to go to Cuz in the jungle for me. I'm not going to try to curse him, and certainly I mean this only on the Rift and not off the Rift, but he's starting to remind me a bit of Clid when he was playing on Hanwha Life, where it's like, you either win your team the game or you lose your team the game. There's not a lot of games where he's just a piece of the team. He's very much been a focal point. Sometimes he plays really well, like he did in game number 2, and sometimes he just throws the game entirely, like he did in games 1 and 3. And I don't really know which version of Cuz we're going to get on a game-to-game basis. He was really starting to play fantastic weeks 3, weeks 4. They were really good for Cuz. Once Bull came in, it felt like a lot of the, process of having to protect bot every single game ended up being freed from him, and he got to just kind of do his own thing. But really, it did not work out in this series. He wasn't the only one. I think Bull played really bad, if I'm being honest. I know it's really popular to be like all in on Bull at the moment, but he's still a young player that didn't do all that well in LCK Challengers. We're kind of expecting him to come back down to earth in this series. Very much felt like that. Him and Ondel both were kind of underwhelming. Ondel, I think, was definitely better than Bull. Also, welcome back, Ondel. Glad he's feeling better in the lineup. Thank you to the comments last week letting me know that he was just sick and that he wasn't benched or anything like that. I was very confused by his not playing, because he's been very good, and he was a bit better in this series, but Bull was not, and that's definitely something we're gonna have to monitor. Bulldog was the second best mid laner in a series against Karis. You would have really hoped that he could step up and actually go toe-to-toe with one of the weaker mids in the LCK, but it just didn't happen here. Dudu got outplayed by Morgan. KDF just kind of wasn't good enough in this series. You want to see more from some of these players, and I would expect that they turn this around. I would expect this is more of a blip on the radar than it is the regular, but you have to imagine that maybe the hot streak that they were on in the last couple of weeks might have been at least a little bit more fraudulent than anticipated. I still think this is a very good team. I'm not going to freak out and worry too much by this loss, but I really don't want to see it again later in the week. And then for Bro, congratulations, you got your first series win. I don't know how many more you're going to get of those over the course of this split. You've been very inconsistent in a bad way. This team is just not very good, but, there were some good things to like here. They had a clear play style that they wanted to execute, which is this late game scaling, kind of inactive, but very, very, team fight oriented style that I think, they'll be able to beat bottom teams with this style. So hopefully they become at least a little bit more competitive, but I would expect this more to be, kind of a one-off or a good week, as Bro is known to have, than anything that I think is entirely sustainable. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, top team versus bottom team. You get how this goes now. It's Hanwha Life Esports taking on NS RedForce. And Hanwha Life is going to be able to pick up the win to nobody's real massive surprise, I think. The only things to take away from this series are that Hanwha's really good. Like, this is a genuinely very good team. We learned that earlier in the week when they were able to take down KT Rolster. The 2-0 week is obviously very strong. Them moving to 8-2, only one game out of first place or one series, I should say, out of first place is pretty darn good. And the way that they're doing it, I think, is super encouraging. You have a bot lane that really makes absolutely no mistakes, is willing to scale into the late game, is willing to play a bit more weak side, while their strong side mid laner is dominating. He's obliterating every 1v1 that he goes into at the current moment in lane, and he plays off his jungler incredibly well. A jungler who, to his credit, is known to enable mid laners at a super high level. So this is a very dangerous team. It's not like Doran's a schmuck on the top side of this map either. This is a very good Hanwha Life team, and for Nongshim, they just couldn't compete. Poor Jiwoo. He really had no shot in this series, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is once again going to go to Zeka in the mid lane. Perhaps maybe I'm gonna get called a bit of Zeka bias, but I just don't really see how you could give player of the series to anyone else in this one. And of course, he had to be a melee merchant. Again, the melee merchant of Tristana and the melee merchant of dominating a game on Orianna. That's Zeka, right? His tiny champion pool. I said all of this last week. I went into depth about how that narrative to me always just didn't really make as much sense as a lot of other narratives that people in the LCK really like to peddle. And I think he's finally starting to break that narrative, and I think people are actually starting to take notice of him breaking that narrative. He was a bit more inconsistent as a player last year, and perhaps maybe we're going to run into a stretch where he isn't going to be as perfect, because that's just who Zeka is. He's going to have good games and bad games. He's very rarely going to be perfect throughout the entirety of a split, but I mean, take notice. This guy is really good on a variety of different champions. All I really hope is that when he does almost certainly have kind of that downswing, that less than stellar 2 weeks or something before he gets back into the zone. I hope that that doesn't completely eliminate the narrative from these people's heads that this guy has actually been very good for a very long time. He was really good on Hanwha last year. Maybe not elite, maybe not a top 3 mid laner in the region, but he was top 4, top 5, somewhere in that range, was a very good player. And I thought he was way undersold going into Worlds on DRX. To me, he was very clearly the best player on that team in the regular season, and I think Worlds was just that, but plus a little bit, right? Like, he obviously looked better at Worlds than he did in the regular season, and he looked better at Worlds than he had at any point in the LCK, but, like, he was still really good. He was my second team All-Pro that season in the LCK. It's not like this came out of nowhere for me. Zeka's always been a very good player, and I'm glad people are starting to notice that. Of course, I think it's also helpful that he gets Peanut as his jungler, who just makes every mid laner that plays with him look like $1 billion. Peanut is so good, and he's always going to be a player that gets a little bit more hate than he deserves. He did that on Gen.G, but I think people generally, or at least the casual LoL community, just understands that Peanut equals wins, that like having Peanut on your team just makes you better in almost every single instance. This guy is one of the greatest junglers of all time. He's right up there with others like, I don't know, like Clearlove and like Score and like Bengi and like Canyon. You know, these are the greatest junglers of all time. Peanut is absolutely very much in that conversation just as much as anybody else, and I think he has absolutely deserved it. He continues to play the engagers better than anybody else in the world. His Vi is just different. It's just different in terms of how he's able to control the map on that champion. Obviously, Sylvie's not a perfect player, but he's actually been playing a bit better and in 2024, and so for Peanut to just completely out-jungle him, it's really impressive, and I think he was also a candidate for player of the series, but Zeka was really good. Bot lane is super stable, and there was so much attention put into that Smolder in game number 2, trying to get the Kai'Sa ahead, and it very much worked. It very much feels like Delight and Peanut work off of each other well, and Viper is really starting to, get more accustomed to how Peanut likes to play the jungle matchups. I think he's getting better at playing weak side. Not that he was bad early on in the split, but just that I think he could have had a bit more impact on the games. I think he's finally settling into a role where it's like, oh, I understand what I'm supposed to do in the mid game. I understand what I'm supposed to do in the late game. I think it just took this team time to figure out the ideologies that they wanted to play on, and I think it's working for them really well right now. Doran continues to be fine on the top side. You know, after having a career breakout year last year on Gen.G, I was really hoping he would continue to dominate here on Hanwha, but he's gotten less resources. It's going to happen. He's just kind of a guy in the top lane right now, but the rest of the team is clicking so much it honestly doesn't matter. This is one of the best teams in the world. And then for Nongshim, they're just not great. Again, they're an interesting team to watch, but when they're not at their best, it's just not going to work. Shout out to Din. Actually had a pretty good series here, was keeping up at least a bit on the on the Udyr and on the Cassante. But it just wasn't enough. The bot lane got obliterated. Jiwoo is going to get my dud of the series. It wasn't even entirely his fault. Again, not really a positioning, error. Could he have been safer? Absolutely. He could have been a lot better. But really, the game plan for Hanwha Life was Jiwoo's their best player. We're going to put Maokai and Vi in the bot lane over and over again, and we're just going to kill that Smolder or the Kalista, specifically in game 2 on the Vi. We're just going to kill that Smolder over and over and over again until he is completely useless. We're not going to just let him randomly scale like KDF did with Bro. We're going to take him out in the early game when he is at his weakest, and that's exactly what they did. Credit to Peanut and credit to Viper and Delight for that, but Jiwoo was not very good and not very effective because of that, and that's why he's getting done of the series. Peter was whatever, could have helped a bit more, but like, what are you going to do on Rel when your team is like getting absolutely destroyed? This is why Rel plus Smolder is always such a risky proposition. The Viego is never going to be able to get resets here. Call Me continues to be an absolute disaster in lane and the mid lane, where Zeka just made absolute quick work of him in the isolated 1v1, getting up like 30 or 40 CS or something like that. Like I said, Din looked interesting, but was the only member of Nongshim that looked interesting in this one. They're just kind of a bottom tier team. Are they as bad as DRX or Bro? In my opinion, no, but they're clearly bottom 3, and I think that was cleared up here. And then for Hanwha, this is a top 3 team, especially after beating KT Rolster. It really feels like they're peaking right now. They found out the style that they like to play. It feels like everybody is starting to buy into the ideology that they want to go with, and it's really working. Zeka is an MVP frontrunner at the current moment. Viper's been amazing. Delight and Peanut are awesome. Like, even Doran's like the best weak side top in the league. This is a strong roster, and you would expect them to be able to play like this for the rest of the year, which is what makes them so dangerous. And now moving on to day number 4 here, and we kick day 4 off with the historic LCK rivalry, the telecom war between T1 and KT Rolster. Unfortunately, it's not like a lot of the others that we've had in the last couple of years. This one, not quite as much of a banger. A pretty solid win for T1. They moved to 9-1 to start the split. KT goes 0-2 this week. I tried to tell y'all. I know, obviously, like, this is a meme, and I want to make it clear, like, this is a meme to me as well, but for so long in 2022, every single week I talked about the 2-0, 0-2 thing when everybody was freaking out about DRX results, when DRX would dominate some good teams and go 2-0 on one week, and then would just completely turn off and go 0-2 against, you know, even good teams, but bad teams as well, you know, during these weeks, and it would just alternate, and they ended up 500, and it was very funny. It was a bit of a meme, but truly, Pioshik and Beryl as a duo, like, this is what you get. This is what you sign up for. You sign up for some series where you can dominate and beat Gen.G and look like the best team in the world and that, and then the next week come out and just not be able to beat two good teams like Hanwha Life or T1, even in a game. And trust me, like, maybe they're not favorites against T1, but they probably were favorites against Hanwha Life in terms of form, and they just couldn't quite get it done. This is the 0-2 that I don't think a lot of people wanted to see. Hopefully they bounce back next week with that 2-0 and they stop alternating sooner rather than later, but it does, you know, it is a little bit of a trend at this point. It's certainly something worth monitoring, but T1 is awesome. This is such a good League of Legends team. Again, undefeated in their last 9 in terms of series. That's pretty darn good. And a lot of the problems that I talked about in their first series of the week against Nongshim just weren't present here. This was a super complete series from a team that you just want to see super complete play from. Player of the series is going to go to KIA in the support position. Shout out to all the people who say he can only play off-meta weird picks. They've just never watched him play. He's so good at every facet of the support position. Yeah, he can pull out Ezreal support, and he can pull out Varus and Caitlyn, and, you know, he can popularize Ashe, and he can make all of that work with the marksman, but you want him to play Alistair and completely take over the game? He can do that too. He's still really freaking good at the actual supports in the game. It's not like a one-dimensional playstyle thing where if you take him off of it, he can't do anything. He's just really good at League of Legends, and he's so much better than everybody else that he's playing into that he often can get away with playing some of these more off-meta picks. KIA is just awesome. He's having a very good split, is looking really good for T1. Faker also looking very good in this series. What else is new? You know, we'll talk about BDD in a second, but in a matchup where it's typically, like, kind of even, BDD usually plays Faker pretty hard. BDD is just not playing well at the start of Spring Split. I don't really know what's up, but his laning has gotten significantly worse in 2024. I don't know if that's going to be something that ends up sticking with him, but at least for now, it actually is a bit concerning. It's not it's not worrisome. We'll talk about him in a minute, but Faker was really good. I want to give a big shout out to Gumayushi in this series. I really kind of criticized him for the play that he had at the beginning of the year. It felt like his positioning was a little off. It felt like he wasn't taking games nearly as seriously, that he was getting caught out in situations where he just normally wouldn't have in previous years. And while I still believe that that kind of stuff is and was happening to him, it's clear when he's locked in, he's still the same Gumayushi that he has been. One of the best AD carries in the world. This was a truly phenomenal ADC performance. Not only did he go deathless across both of these games, but he did it while being super aggressive and also actively pushing his team forward alongside KIA. This was a superstar level ADC performance, so good to see that. Zeus is dominating everybody. Owner has been solid. Again, not exceptional, just really, really solid, really good at playing within the structure that Faker and KIA are creating as a macro duo, and that's all you really need him to do. T1 is just clicking right now. Again, it's really hard to get any sort of read on them because they are kind of just beating people, and especially against the good teams, they're just so much better than them. We're really just waiting for that rematch against Gen.G. That's really all that we have left to look forward to in terms of learning more about this T1 team and whether or not they can adapt to get to the top of the LCK. But for KT Rolster on the other side, not a great series, if we're being entirely honest. Getting absolutely obliterated by T1 isn't the worst thing in the world. It's not like T1's a bad team, but, you know, telecom wars are supposed to be fun and interactive and back and forth and fast-paced, and this just wasn't it. This was just not close. KT really was never in this series for even a millisecond, and it was their carry duo that I think really let them down. We talked about Pioshik and Beryl not playing well in the first series. It was BDD and Deft that I think really underperformed in this one. Deft is going to get my dud of the series. I'm a little less concerned about him because he has been so good at the start of the year. He's carried in a lot of the, you know, strong side tendencies he learned on Dplus KIA last year here to KT Rolster, adding alongside the familiarity he already has with Pioshik and Beryl. It's really worked out for him, and I think that he's obviously been such a huge part of why this team has started so hot, but he got caught out a bunch in this series. He was just playing a little bit over aggressive, and Guma was better, and KIA was better, and that's going to happen every once in a while. You're not going to freak out about that, but it is worth noting Deft was not very good in this series, certainly the worst that he has played since returning here to KT Rolster. And then BDD is the one that I'm a bit more concerned about. Talked about it a bit before, but his laning has been really poor over the course of the start of the year. His stats really aren't all that bad, but the eye test, he really fails. Like, he's not winning his winning matchups as hard as other players are, and he's losing, you know, neutral matchups, and that's really not where you want to be. It doesn't feel like he feels very comfortable playing around this core of Pyosik, Deft, and Beryl. Where they were really at their best was when they were enabling mid lane, like Pyosik and Beryl in particular, when they had a player like Zeka who could, you know, really dominate isolated in a 1v1 once he got ahead. You could just kind of give him a bit of resources for the first 10 minutes and then play super aggro because you know he's going to pull a lot of attention. BDD just hasn't been that same guy. He's much more of a supportive mid laner, at least in terms of how he has fit into this KT Rolster roster in particular, and I just don't think it's working out. I don't think BDD's been bad. I just don't think he has been, you know, the star mid laner that we think he is, you know, that we thought he was going to be going into the year. The other top 5 mids, or I guess the top 4 mids, are really dominating. Faker's been great, Chovy's been great, Zeka's been great, Showmaker's been great. BDD is not caught up to that so far in 2024, in my opinion. He's really left a lot of that up to the DRX players on this team, something worth noting. Perfect is also very much not perfect at the moment. He's not a completed product. We're still waiting for him to get a lot more comfortable, but he definitely needs to start being better. KT just didn't look good this week. It was an 0-2 week. I'm not going to freak out if they come back out next week and look really good. Then we know that they're just going to be a really good team with inconsistencies. Hopefully that ends up being the case rather than them getting a little bit more exploited by the good teams now that they're actually being tested. It's certainly interesting, but I think this, you know, takes away any sort of conversation around them being a top 2 team like was there last week after the win over Gen.G. But for T1, they absolutely are a top 2 team. It's them and Gen.G in the top, and really we're all just waiting on the inevitable rematch that happens in the regular season and, you know, seeing them really go head to head. These are the 2 best teams. Maybe Hanwha Life sneaks their way in there, but, you know, T1 has definitely reclaimed one of those top spots, and really there's no looking back ever since that first series. And speaking of the top teams in the league, moving on to our second series of day number 4, it was Gen.G taking on FearX. And Gen.G predictably is also going to pick up a win here on day number 4, also moving to 9-1. I know I talk about Gen.G and T1 as parallels here in the LCK, but that's because they kind of just are at the moment. They are clearly the 2 best teams in the region, and they have been for like 3 straight years, and so it's very difficult to separate them. They are always in competition with each other. These wins are to match each other, and it's always fun because they're almost always on the same day in terms of their games, which is really great scheduling by the LCK, by the way. But for FearX, like, they're just not good enough to be able to beat Gen.G. Game 2 was actually kind of close. There were moments where it was like, oh, like, the Varus has a lot of gold, and Nocturne's going to be a bit of a problem. You've got a Cassante, even if he's super kind of behind, to try and deal with, but Chovy said, no, I'm good. Like, I got somewhere to be in like 5 minutes, so I'm just going to end the game. And that was pretty cool. That was pretty good of him. Chovy's going to get player of the series for that, for the Azir end. He's just so good at the game. The fact that there is somebody who in the LCK, who a lot of people consider, you know, one of, if not the tougher domestic leagues, like top 2 in terms of domestic leagues in the entire world. You have a player like that who, at any point, against any team, can just be like, I'm tired of playing this game, I just want it to end, I'm going to win the game on the spot. It is just ridiculous how good Chovy is. In my opinion, pretty clear frontrunner at the current moment for the MVP race in the LCK. I think he has been the best player for the best team in the LCK so far this year. Now, we're only halfway through the split. I'm not saying I'm giving it to him guaranteed, but I would be remiss to not say he really does feel like the frontrunner at the current moment. He's just been fantastic. What a shocker. Chovy is really good. Everybody is so surprised. I mean, I defend this guy all the time. People in the comment sections of all my off-season videos will always say that he's never as good as I think he is. He's not the best mid laner in the world. I just don't think we're watching the same games. I get it. Like, he doesn't have the world title. He's only been to world semis twice. You want him to have more international success on that front, but his domestic success, at least at this point, is becoming a bit unparalleled. Like, he truly is maybe the greatest domestic LCK player ever. I mean, the guy's won 3 straight titles here on Gen.G. He's at least in the conversation. I mean, obviously, Faker's going to be in the conversation. Ruler is going to be in that conversation, but Chovy has very much made his mark on that conversation, and, you know, there's really no disputing that anymore. He has been phenomenal, and he was awesome in this game on the Azir in particular. We're seeing a rise in Aurelion Sol here in the LCK. I don't expect that to continue. This is not a particularly good champion in my eyes, at least at the current moment. Just way too slow in order to get going. I understand it's kind of like the Smolder of mid lane, but at that point, just play Smolder mid lane. Like, Smolder's really good and can be flexed around. I don't really get the point of Aurelion Sol, but maybe you guys in the comments will let me know why you might prioritize that over some of the other, you know, hyperscalers, things like Azir, things like Corki even, who is still relatively strong even after the nerfs. I'm just surprised to see A-Sol get a pick here, and we'll talk about that champion a bit more later in the week as well, but the rest of the team was still good. Canyon had a very good week, 2 games of Lee Sin. He's going to dominate on Lee Sin. It's just kind of what he does. You would have hoped he could have been a bit more useful in the back half of game number 2, but was still pretty good. Keen was awesome. The Cassante in game 1 was really, really annoying. I mean, Henna had gold on the Zeri, and then K'Sante just completely invalidated anything that champion wanted to do. Shout out to Henna. Really didn't get to play the end of game number 1. The only thing you can really say negative about Gen.G is this was the first time where the bot lane didn't look particularly good. They were probably the worst bot lane in this series, which is very weird to say, but Lehens was just not on his A game today. A lot of weird engages, almost inty engages, but it's Lehens. It's going to happen every once in a while. You take the good with the bad. The bad is like 5% of the games, and the good is like 95% of the games. I think I will take the 5% happening in some random series against FearX. And I think Pays could have been a little bit better, but I say, oh, we could have been a little bit better, and the dude gets a pentakill in game number 2. So, like, what am I talking about? You know what I mean? I just think the laning phases weren't particularly good, but he is playing Smolder and Zeri. So, you know, again, what do I know? I just think Lehens could have been a bit better here, but Chovy was amazing. Keen was amazing. Canyon was very good in this series. Gen.G is very difficult to stop. Even when some of their players aren't playing perfect, they're still one of the best teams in the world. And then for Fox on the other side, you actually had some positives here. I thought Henna had a very good series, one of his better ones in a Fox uniform so far. I thought the Zeri in game 1 had a chance to win it. I thought the Varus in game 2 had a chance to win it. They just weren't good enough, right? Like, the rest of the team wasn't good enough to be able to peel for him. Willer was active on the Nocturne, but that champion can only do so much. Like, truly, I think Nocturne's one of the most over-prioritized junglers in the entire game at the current moment. I like Nocturne. He's a fun pick in solo queue. But in pro, like I always say, he's often just trading 1-for-1, and you're hoping to just try to give the rest of your team the opportunity to be able to win 4v4 fights, and it's really not always that simple, right? You're not always going to be able to get as many leads as you would want. A dud of the series is going to go to Clear. I actually contemplated giving this to Lehens in the support position, but Clear was so bad on the Poppy in game number 1 that I really just had to give it to him. If he only played like he did in game 2 on the K'Sante throughout the series, then Lehens probably would have been done of the series here, but Clear was so bad on the Poppy that you really have to point it out. He's not very good at that champion. Execute was pretty solid. Closer was definitely the worst of the two mids, but didn't get absolutely destroyed. That's kind of become the story of Closer's time here in the LCK. Certainly not one of the better mids in the region, but isn't the worst mid either. It's what I've been saying about him for the last 2 years, even when he was an all-pro 2 years ago, which I still find to be utterly ludicrous, but it is what it is. Closer is exactly what he is now, and it's what he's been for a long time. Fox is just a mad team. Like, again, they're on this gigantic losing streak. I think it's like a 5 or 6 series losing streak, something like that. We knew this was going to happen. They've only played the best teams in the league, and they're only going to play more hard teams for the next foreseeable future. Once they get back into playing Nongshim and Bro and, you know, teams of that, you know, DRX teams of that caliber, they're probably going to be able to beat them. This is a team with talent, just not good enough to beat a team like Gen.G. And then for Gen.G, like, again, this is one of the best teams in the world, if not the best team in the world at the current moment. Chovy is certainly playing like the best player in the world at the moment. Keen has been awesome. Canyon has really, really come alive. The last 2 weeks of him have been, you know, top jungler in LCK territory. And even when Lehens plays a little bit, you know, under expectation, like, this team is still able to dominate a middle tier team. And so, yeah, Gen.G's pretty darn good. 18-4 definitely proves that. And that's going to bring us into our 5th and final day of the LCK in week number 5. It's not the final day, spoiler alert, and that is because of this series. Some wild stuff happening. It's DRX taking on Dplus KIA, and on paper, when you look at this, you're like, what's so weird about it? You know, it was 3 games, and they weren't particularly long. Like, what was so crazy? Well, if you didn't watch the series, there was a pause in game number 3 that lasted 7 hours. A 7-hour pause. I was losing my mind. I literally shut the stream off. I came back like 4 hours later, and it was still on. I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, it was like 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the East Coast of the United States of America when this series ended. I mean, it was truly incomprehensible, unfathomable. I feel so bad for these players, but I guess I'll talk about the gameplay that we saw mostly before the pause, but all of this is with the caveat that this pause sucked. Like, this sucks. And so, you know, credit to both of these teams for sticking through it, whether or not they won or lost. But let's talk about it. Player of the series for me on the side of DK is going to go to Lucid in this one. Probably the best series that he's had in quite a while. Again, with the caveat that he's playing into Sponge, and Sponge is really not the best jungler in the world. We will get to that. Certainly has been the weakest in the LCK so far this year, but Lucid finally had a series where he was the primary facilitator for what this team wanted to do, rather than someone like Kellen in the support position who they'd been relying a lot to create plays. for this team, and Lucid did a great job in this series of being able to do that, specifically in my opinion on the Maokai. I thought it was a really, really good series from him, and it really does show kind of the reason that they wanted to invest into him instead of bringing back someone like Canyon this year. He was amazing as both a carry and a facilitator in the Challengers League, and I think he's really starting to get a bit more comfortable playing off of Showmaker. Showmaker was also great, and honestly, you could probably give player of the series to Showmaker, and it would probably mean just as much in this particular circumstance, but I think Lucid was honestly more important towards this team's success in this series, and that's a really important thing to say. These two are really developing a nice chemistry together, and I just need Lucid to be like a replacement, an average level, jungler in the league. The bottom teams really struggle to be able to keep up. If he can be a top 5 jungler, he doesn't need to be top 3 or top 4 or top 2 or anything like that. If he can be top 5, if he can just survive and be good enough to be okay against the best teams in the world while also destroying the bad teams, that's certainly good enough for DK to be able to win, because Showmaker has been good enough to be able to play off of that. Like I said, Showmaker was awesome, loved him on the Karma, loved him on the Azir, both looked very good. He's just a playmaker. He's going to go out there and do a lot of things. The Lee Sin, by the way, for Lucid was also very good, but it's always been very good. I think Kellen was amazing in this series on the Rakan and the Tahm Kench. Again, another player who just never really gets the respect that he deserves on this team. He's not a perfect player, but he's a lot more versatile and varied, I think, in terms of how he likes to play the game than he gets credit for. He was very good here. Kingen was very good. This was the best week that he has had so far since joining DK, in my opinion. On the top side of the map, aiming was fine. DK was better. I mean, it's DRX. What do you want? Like, this team was very, very good in this matchup. And then for DRX on the other side, there are positives, I guess, to take away from here. I think Satab actually played one of his better series in the while. He was really good in game number 2 on the Azir. That's a champion that obviously works really well at the LCK level, but he genuinely beat Showmaker in the second game here, which is very big. That's a good thing for Satab. Wasn't able to carry that over into the game 3 on the Orianna, but still was really successful here. Rascal was better than he has been in a long time in this series, specifically on the Cassante in game 2. He has been horrendous in 2024, and he was really bad down the stretch of 2023 as well. Underrated bad. I think people chalk that up to mental, but it was playstyle. Like, his mechanics were really starting to wear off. This was the first time where I was like, is he not the worst top laner in the LCK? And, obviously he wasn't perfect, especially in their losses, but he at least had a good game, which is something he hasn't had in a while. Unfortunately for DRX, their bot lane was actually a bit of a problem in this series. Pliata did not play well. Teddy probably had his worst series of the split up until this point. We talk about Teddy being a player that, doesn't really win, but he doesn't lose either. It's not like he's, like, getting destroyed. He's just going up in CS and not doing anything about it. That's kind of the MO for Teddy. But in this series, he actually did lose. Aiming was pretty good, and Kellen actually just outplayed Teddy and Pliata pretty clearly in this series. He was the best player in the bot lane, and I don't think it was particularly close. Not freaking out. Again, Pliata is a rookie, or I guess a pseudo-rookie. He's not really a rookie because he's played before, but, he's coming back in from the Challengers League. I'm not going to freak out about an inconsistent series against a good support, but, Teddy definitely underperforming is not ideal. 7 hours, it's a crazy series. Sponge, by the way, is done of the series. He got completely out-jungled by Lucid, and that's really not a good sign. Lucid's really been a bottom half jungler, I would say, over the course of this split up until this point. And so for Sponge to also get out jungled by him, he's just not good enough to play here at the LCK level. If they weren't already like begging Tarzan to come over to this team, I think that conversation simply has to start now. I don't know if it'll make them a contender, but at the very least, Sponge is just not good enough to play in the LCK, and that has become abundantly clear. But for DRX, this is maybe the worst team in the LCK. I mean, Bro actually got a win this week, and we'll see them, in the second series of today, whether or not they can get another, but this team is very bad. 1-9 is not good, and they don't really have a lot of room for upside. Their young players are not developing in the ways that you would like, although Satab was okay here, and I really like Pliata. He's been very good. I just don't think that you have enough firepower here. Sponge is going to limit their upside pretty drastically. And then for DK, 2-0 week, pretty solid. Even if it did take 7 hours to get there, you were able to move out of this week 500 and above 500 in terms of game score, 12 and 11 in terms of game score, which is a pretty good place to be at, I would say, generally overall. Like where DK is headed, I'm not going to freak out and say that they're immediately back into the top 4 or anything like that, but this is the start that you would need in order for them to get back to the place that I think they wanted to be at all along. And then I guess moving on to day number 6, or the final real day here of LCK action because of the postponement of this series. It was a rematch of something we already saw this week. Okay, BRION taking on the Kwangdong Freecs. And just like earlier this week, OK BRION is going to pick up yet another series win. They went 2-0 this week to move to 2-8. They won their first 2 series in back-to-back series. Very fun to see, and it was against KDF, who went from being a team that was white hot, on the rise, looking really good, to a team that just lost 2 straight series to Bro. That is not particularly good. They were 2-4 against Bro over 6 games this week. Not particularly good to see from them. Obviously, very weird that they would play each other in the same week, but it's just how the LCK scheduling ends up going, and KDF definitely suffers for it. We'll kind of take that into account later on, but good for Bro, man. They just had a very good week. It feels like they have KDF's number, and honestly, this was a pretty good effort from them. Basically, everybody looking very good on this series, and I really want to point out a couple of players in particular. Player of the series for me is going to go to Lord Morgan up in the top lane. He really has Dudu's number across this week. It was really, really fun to see. Dudu, like I said, you know, usually these two have bangers against each other, but it almost always goes in favor of Dudu, whether that was on Hanwha, whether that is now here on Kwangdong. Last year, like on Kwangdong, Morgan did a really good job, though, of turning the tides in this series. And, you know, in this week, it was really, really good stuff from him. The Aatrox in Game 3 is really what he's getting this player of the series for. He ended this series. He took over the end of game number 3, really dominated. And honestly, this was the Morgan that we were getting hyped up over, you know, last year and a couple of years ago when he first joined Bro. This player who was significantly better than the team around him, somebody who was really starting to make a name for himself after being ostracized on Hanwha Life many years ago from just being put in a position that he wasn't necessarily ready for, having to play with really, really top-tier players on that HLE team like Chovy. And obviously, Morgan just was never going to be able to live up to that, but he's really been awesome for Bro. And even if he hasn't had the strongest start to this year, it's nice to see him starting to come around as we hit the middle part of the split. Karis was also very good here. 3 games of Azir into Aurelion Sol. I told you we weren't done talking about Asol. I'm just not a fan of this pick. Bulldog picked it 3 games in a row, completely uncontested. I really don't get it. Like, I get game 2 was pretty okay from KDF, and Bulldog really wasn't all that awful there, and he wasn't all that bad in this series as a whole, but Karis had so much pressure across the map because Azir puts on so much pressure into Asol that you were basically conceding the first 15 minutes of the game from a player that is known more for his skirmishing than he is for his late game team fighting. It was just a very weird decision in draft. I don't want to see more Asol. I don't want to see Asol paired up with Misfortune. I don't think that's a particularly strong way to play the game, and I think KDF ended up suffering for it. But we're not even talking about that. Karis did end up capitalizing on that. He had a good week here. 2 series against Bulldog, and he was better in both series. Definitely exciting to see that. Envy also played really well this week, probably well enough to keep himself in the lineup, but Polu, I think, had a better series here than he's had in a little while. Was very aggressive in terms of the engages he was offering on champions like Rakan and Nautilus and Maokai, and that's what you want to see. You want to see a player go out and actively try and change the game, and I think that's exactly what Bro did here, and so really like how they played. Gideon was fine too, but it was Morgan and Envy, in my opinion, that really stood out as kind of, you know, pretty good this week. Morgan in particular, I think, is somebody who you can maybe expect that to continue with, but obviously Bro's schedule is going to get a bit different. They're not just going to play KDF the entire year, so hopefully they can keep this up. But for KDF, I mean, this is not good. This was a really bad week number 5 for them. All the momentum that they had generated is now, poof, gone. As soon as you got excited about them, they disappeared. Maybe the remnants of KT Cuz are still there because, you know, people started to really feel this team start to pretty consistently put them in their top 5. In terms of power rankings, they beat Dplus KIA last week, and it felt pretty good, but now here they are 5-5 after losing 2 series to Bro, and they're 500 in terms of game score, and some of the players really aren't playing as well. Dead of the series is going to go to Bull in the bot lane. Really didn't like how Bull played this series. I thought his positioning was really bad, and specifically on the Ezreal and the Smolder, it just wasn't particularly good. I wanted to see a lot more out of him. Obviously, he was somebody who was overperforming in his first bit of, you know, series in the LCK. He was awesome in week number 2, was still really good in weeks 3 and 4. But it's not super surprising to see him kind of crash back down to earth. This was a player who had question marks in the Challengers League. He was never really an upper tier AD carry in tier 2 of Korea. So to see him be so good so early on in his LCK tenure was definitely a bit of a shock. And I think this was definitely more of a crashing back down to earth kind of series for him. Do I think he's going to be better moving forward? You have to hope that he will be. And obviously, he still was able to do a lot. The Misfortune did end up working for him in game number 2, even if I don't like the theory behind it in draft. And Ondel was really good in this series. The Alistair was really solid to be able to set it up, and maybe the Nautilus was really bad in game 1, but the Karma was a little better in game 3. I think this bot lane just needs to be better, and that was really something to point out. Cuz was also just not really a factor in either of these series, was definitely not really as aggressive as maybe he should have been into a team like Bro. We criticized KDF for essentially allowing Bro to scale into the late game, but they really leaned a little too far into it. Aurelion Sol plus Smolder in game number 1? No thanks, man. Like, I don't want to wait on that. Even with the Garen in the top lane, like, I don't really want to be drafting 2 champions that don't really have any sort of impact until 30 minutes into the game. It's just not a strategy that I think is going to win. I think their drafts were a little bit too cooked, and then you're like, oh, who's their coach? Oh yeah, CV Max. Okay, never mind. I'm not surprised. This is a very CV Max draft, and so, but Dudu he could have been better. You love to see Garen, but it's still not able to win in the LCK, and the Cassante really wasn't actually that good in this series, especially in game 3, just got completely outplayed by Morgan, and so generally KDF was just not great here, and that's a little bit surprising. For them to go 0-2 against Bro, and 2-4 in games, that's really bad, and hopefully they're going to be able to bounce back next week, but week 5 is definitely one to forget for them. And then for Bro, their first 2 wins of the season come against the same team. We've seen Bro succeed in certain weeks in the past, even when they were bad. Usually it's at the beginning of a split. That's always kind of been Bro's specialty, is they'll randomly have these 2-0 weeks where they beat bad teams and then they crash back down to earth later on. I expect the same to happen here. I don't think that this is going to be a team that ends up actually being good in any sort of way, but it's nice to see that, at least in the perfect circumstance, they're actually going to be able to pick up wins, and there are talented players on this team. I just would be surprised if they were able to put it together for more than just this week. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 5 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings after 5 weeks of action. We've got number 1 to number 10. Of course, top 6 is playoffs, which does feel relatively decided at this point. But of course, on the screen in the first column to the right, you can see power rankings. That's my personal power rankings of these teams from number 1 to number 10. In the second column, you can see how those have changed from last week to this week. We can go over the risers and the fallers and the changers and all that stuff, but there really aren't a lot. Basically, everything continuing to go as planned here in the LCK. 1, 2, staying the same. I still think Gen.G T1. Gen.G beat them last time. That's really the only reason they're staying at number 1. That next matchup between the two will matter a lot. Hanwha Life, though, moving back up to number 3 after beating KT Rolster, after KT really struggled this week against some of the better teams in the league. I don't really think there's any argument to be made that KT is top 3 after this week. I think that's just unfortunate, but it is what it is. It was an 0-2 week, so hopefully they bounce back in week number 6, but maybe controversially, KDF sticking place at 5 and DK staying at 6. KDF still beat DK, and this was a weird week for KDF. Yes, they dropped both series to Bro, but it was so out of character that I almost want to believe that it was just a weird week and that they're going to come back and be good again in week number 6, and honestly, that's what I'm expecting. Obviously, you would have hoped they would have picked up both wins this week, but alas, losing both is certainly awful, but I would expect KDF to actually be fine here, and DK definitely needs to prove that they belong back in that number 5 spot, which they did. They weren't able to do last week. So for now, they stay the same. 7 and 8 also stay the same, Fox and Nongqing, but Bro is going to jump up to number 9 with DRX falling down to last place, number 10, because of their 2 wins. I honestly debated keeping it the same just because I don't expect Bro to actually be good or, better than what they have been before this in the split, but, DRX is just as bad, and so for them, their record's worse, so they're going to fall to 10. That really is the difference. I think both of these teams are the 2 worst teams in the league in terms of what they have shown, and Bro actually has 2 wins on their resume. They were able to go 2-0 this week. They've proven more than DRX has, even though DRX beat them earlier on in the split. So Bro moves up to 9, DRX moves to 10. Let me know if you guys agree or disagree down in the comment section below. Should I have moved KDF after this disastrous week? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below, but it's time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 5, and this one was not particularly difficult. There were a lot of good options, but player of the week for me was pretty clearly Zeka from Hanwha Life Esports. He was amazing in both of their series. Whether it was on the Yone, whether it was on the Tristana or the Orianna, whatever he ended up playing, he ended up excelling on, and that's a really big positive. This guy is just so freaking good at League of Legends, and he's finally starting to get maybe some respect that he deserves. I just hope that it ends up continuing throughout the rest of the year. But runners up for me, Chovy, Showmaker, 2 of the other big 3 or big 4, I guess, mid laners players right now in the LCK. You've got Zeka, you've got Chovy, you've got Showmaker all listed here. Faker could absolutely have been an honorable mention, a runner-up for Player of the Week this week. I think you could also put Morgan in here from Bro, who was very good in their series. But to me, Zeka, Chovy, Showmaker definitely showed out. Chovy kind of leading the MVP race. Showmaker really dragging the corpse of DK across the finish line at the current moment. Both of them very much deserve their mention, but like I said, a lot of good options this week. And then Dud of the Week in week number 5, unfortunately, is going to go to Sponge, the jungler for DRX. Just not a particularly good week for him. There was a lot going wrong for DRX, and they look like the worst team in the league, and Sponge consistently looks like he's getting out-jungled every single game. I know this is somebody who has obviously struggled a lot, and we've seen the emotion come out on stage before this year, but it's just not been very good in terms of results, and there's really no other way to overlook that. There were other options this week. I think someone like BDD didn't play particularly well. I think someone like, you know, even a Bull could have definitely been considered for this for KDF, who really underperformed, but generally, Sponge was probably the worst player in the league this week, and he has been one of the worst players in the LCK in terms of the performances he's offered, which is unfortunate, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Leave a like on this video. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK on this channel. We post about all 4 of the major regions. That's LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL, as well as the NACL, Tier 2 over in North America, every single week that they play here on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.